Well, hello again, everybody. This is another lecture in a series on the law and education policy in Alberta and across Canada. I thought the best way to start thinking about education law and education policy in Canada and in Alberta was to start by looking at the Constitution. I mean, I don't know how many of you are really that aware or familiar with the Constitution. I know maybe I take it for granted that many of you would know because you maybe have taken some political science courses, or perhaps you can even remember back to when you were in high school maybe and you learned about the Canadian Constitution. But I thought I would do this with you right now because the Canadian Constitution, formerly the BNA Act, has sections 92 and 93. 93 is all about education. 92 mentions that education is an area of provincial jurisdiction. So let's talk a little bit about how education is organized in Canada. So how do we understand education in Canada? Canada is a federal state. A federal state is one in which there is a division of powers between two orders of government. Okay, so Canada has two orders of government. It's the national and the provincial orders. So as a note here, you may be thinking, well, but what about municipal governments, right? Well, they're just creatures made and unmade by the provinces. Like, they have no constitutional status. They could be taken away tomorrow. You get rid of a municipal government. They don't have any sovereign power unto themselves like a national or a provincial government does. Okay? In a federal state, we call the national government also the federal government, even though provincial governments are a part of our federal state as well. So, both the federal and the provincial governments have a degree of sovereignty. Federalism implies divided sovereignty, all right? So it's split. Sometimes it's an unequal split, sometimes it's an equal split, right? The idea when Canada started is that we were going to have equal sovereignty, that sovereignty was going to be equal between the provinces and the feds, that they were going to be masters of their own domains, right? Different people had different visions. Sometimes the balance was this, tipped this way or that way. John A. Macdonald, he personally wanted to see more of a tip towards the federal or national side than the provincial side, whereas obviously the other fathers of Confederation who were running provincial governments, they were more interested in seeing provincial rights and provincial, the sovereignty of the provinces strengthened. And then you can see how the federal sovereignty in a federal system like Canada, how it shifts through major, societal things like wars, typically like a big war or a big national crisis tips things in the direction of, a stronger national government than a provincial government or something like that. But generally, that's what divided sovereignty is, okay? It's where sovereignty is split between the two different orders of government. Sovereignty, what is it? It's the supreme power of the state. It's the authority to override all other authorities. Sovereignty can be thought of as a bundle of powers associated with the highest authority of government. It's the power to enforce rules of conduct, power to make law, executive powers to raise taxes, have an army, mint money, provide services. Underlying ownership of all land is included in there, right? The division of these powers in Canada is laid out in sections 91 through 95 of the British North America Act, or the BNA Act of 1867, much later renamed the Constitution Act in 1982. Okay, so sections 91 through 95. I've just drawn a little Venn diagram here for you, but Section 91 is all about all the powers that the federal government or the national government is supposed to have, and you can see that I've listed them there. Section 92 lays out all the powers of the provincial government, the exclusive powers of the provincial government. Section 93 is cordoned off unto itself. That's the section on education, ladies and gentlemen. And education is a provincial responsibility, but it's got this little tweaky bit in there that allows the national government to step in crazy circumstances. And I'll give you an example of one of those crazy circumstances. And then the one where the two meet in a crosshair, that's the area of concurrent jurisdiction in Section 95 pertaining to immigration and agriculture. So I've highlighted two sections there. You can see one education and the other one native peoples and reserves, right? This is hairy in Canada, see? Because, I mean, what? Native people and reserves, they have to get educations, don't they? So what about their education? Well, it's bizarre, but like in Canada, even though everybody else gets educated and education is administered by the provinces, if you're a native person and you live on reserve and you want to go to the maybe you don't want to, maybe you just have to too, right? But you're going to the local school on the reservation. That school is administered to by the national government. The provinces won't do anything to help, right? They're like, well, that's your deal, right? Because native people under the BNA Act are considered like basically wards of the state. They're almost like orphan children. Like it's a very paternalistic system we have, and then all that is. We'll look at it in another lecture, but you'll see how Native people and everything to do with Native people is all managed by this thing we have called the Indian Act, which has been around forever, and it's a really problematic document. But that's so. Just remember when you're thinking about education in Canada, Native people on reserves going to reserve school. That's under federal jurisdiction, not provincial jurisdiction. Every other place in Canada, it's all provincial, okay? Okay, so here is Section 93. Those divisions I just showed you, that was all Sections 91, 92, and 95. This is Section 93, legislation respecting education. In and for each province, the legislature may exclusively make laws in relation to education, subject and according to the following provisions. 1. Nothing in any such law shall prejudicially affect the right or privilege with respect to denominational schools, which any class of persons have by law in the province at union. 2. All powers, privileges, and duties at the union by law confirmed and imposed in Upper Canada on the separate schools and school trustees and the Queen's Roman Catholic subjects shall be and the same and hereby extended to dissentient schools of the Queen's Protestant and Roman Catholic subjects in Quebec. 3. Where in any province a system of separate or dissentient schools exists by law at the Union or is thereafter established by the legislature of the province, an appeal shall lie to the Governor-General in Council from any act or decision of any provincial authority affecting any right or privilege of the Protestant or Roman Catholic minority and the Queen's subjects in relation to education. 4. In case any such provincial law as from time to time seems to the Governor-General in Council requisite for the due execution of the provisions of the section is not made, or in case any decision of the Governor-General in Council on any appeal under this section is not duly executed by the proper provincial authority in that behalf. Then, in every such case, and as far as the circumstances of each case require, the Parliament of Canada may make remedial laws for the due execution of the provision of this section and any decision of the Governor-General in Council under this section. Wow, so I probably just read that to you and you're like, what is... Okay, this is some different stuff here, folks. What does it mean? When we look at it, you can first of all see, okay, well, provinces get to legislate about education, right? Then the next it says immediately something about denominational schools. So in Canada, at the beginning, in 1867, prior to that, we had Upper and Lower Canada, right? Upper Canada was what we call Ontario, Lower Canada was what we call Quebec. Ontario's mostly English, but there's French people there. Quebec is mostly French, but there's English people there. English people were mostly Protestant. French people were mostly Catholic. Okay, so and it was like George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. They didn't get along, right? They didn't see eye to eye. Different. So they wanted protections from one another, right? If you're English and you're living in a majority French place, you got, the danger is that the French people are all going to gang up on you and treat you like crap, right? Or conversely, if you're French and you're living in a place where mostly everybody's English, the danger is that the majority English types are going to go and be all ignorant towards you and mistreat you as a French person, or rather as a Catholic person, right? Or rather as a Protestant person. So you can see, the idea behind Canada getting together and us coming together, and instead of these little colonies like Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, we want to become a country, but I'm not going to join with you guys if me as a French person or a French Catholic, that's just signing my own death warrant. I want protections for me and for my way of life and for my culture and for my religion, right? And then the English guys are saying the same thing. Yeah, well, I live in Quebec and I want the same thing for my kids. And so this is one of those things that's kind of unique to Canada. It's pretty cool, actually. It's the best thing about politics. It's like compromise, right? Well, let's get together and we recognize that we don't always get along. We're not always going to see eye to eye, but we're gonna respect each other's rights. We're gonna set it down so that you can live and not live in fear that if you're in a minority that you're going to be mistreated. And so that had to do with religion, and religion was always tied to education, right? Because pretty much at the time, education was administered to, in some of these places anyway, by the church and by the churches. Okay, so where that system existed at the time that province entered Confederation, it was said, if you come in with that, then it's protected. Don't worry, no one. The province, when it becomes a province as opposed to a colony unto itself, it can't screw with you. You're safe, and your people are safe, and your religious group is safe. Okay, so it was an assurance. And without Section 93, folks, Canada would not exist. This section on education was like the most important part of the whole Constitution. It was the linchpin. All right. Now today, people would kind of piss on it. They'd say, this is ridiculous. I mean, this is actually it's a form of discrimination. What about all the other religions? Well, but recognize that, okay, we get that nowadays most people probably aren't even religious in Canada, especially in Quebec, right? But if we are religious, there's so many different religions. Why this is silly? It's a piece of history. But it's such an important piece of history, and without this piece of history, there would be no Canada. So pissing all over it is kind of like cutting off the hand that feeds you, or like denying really something that was so important and essential to the formation of Canada and what makes Canada this wonderful, excellent country. Okay, and you can see there too in the final third and fourth sections there about how, even though it's provincial, when there's something fishy going on, when a province starts to fart around with denominational rights or separate school or dissentient school rights, then the feds can step in and make remedial laws. See, so that's why this is sectioned off from Section 92. It's cordoned off a little bit because Section 92 was all about provincial exclusive jurisdiction. this you can see it's of course it's provincial, but then in a certain way it's also not. Okay, so the Canadian Constitution versus the American Constitution with regard to religion. I wanted to bring this up just because it's an interesting point. We always think about, when people who why do we have these dissentient schools? Why should there be Catholic schools? That's ridiculous. And you can find all kinds of blogs on the internet, and people wanting to abolish them, and politicians wanting to abolish them, and it goes on and on, right? But they talk about the division of, or the separation of church and state and all this stuff, right? Well, what they're thinking of is the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right? Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion. So, in other words, no religion ought to ever be incorporated into public education. Public education has to be bereft of or wholly separate from religion. The state cannot support or identify with any particular religion at all, right? That is, part of the American founding. Now, funny, because America has, religion is such, I would say religion is a really big thing in the United States in a way that it isn't in Canada. But this is called the Disestablishment Clause. And unlike in the States where they have a Disestablishment Clause as their First Amendment, Canada is built upon careful denominational protections for French Catholic minorities in Upper Canada, or Ontario, and English Protestant minorities in Lower Canada, or Quebec. Indeed, without the denominational protections entrenched in Section 93 of the BNA Act, 1867, concerning education, there would have been no Canada. So this is why in Canada we're allowed constitutionally to discriminate on the basis of these two religions, or these religious divisions in educational matters. Why, for instance, funding for Catholic separate schools is constitutionally protected in certain provinces, and I say certain provinces, and why other religious groups can't claim constitutional rights to government funding for religious schools, despite this being quite clearly unequal treatment, right? There's been some court cases about this, where people have said, well, why should only Catholics get, constitutional rights to funding? Why not other groups? There's a famous one that went to the United Nations, and the United Nations said, yeah, this is totally unfair. You guys in Canada, you've got it all wrong. If you're going to have funding for Catholic schools, mandatory funding, then you must offer mandatory funding for any religion that wants to have a school in Canada. And I guess that's their opinion in United Nations, because they're United Nations, but they don't get that it's not how our Constitution works in Canada. Our Constitution says that, we have these certain specific protections. They're historically rooted in the Constitution. They can't be taken out of the Constitution. Not in that manner. Province can choose or not choose to fund other religious groups. Okay? So here's Canada, right at Confederation. We think of Canada as the second largest country, but back at its beginnings, it was just these four provinces. And notice how tiny Ontario was and Quebec was at the time in comparison to them now, right? Rupert's Land, that was territory in Canada. That was all the land that was said to flow into Hudson's Bay. And then further west you have the Northwestern Territory there, and British Columbia, and all that land in white there, that was all still, and Newfoundland as well, right? All that land was still under British possession. So Canada, when it started, it was just this little section here. And those four provinces had different, when they entered Confederation, they had different educational systems. So it just so happened that in Ontario and Quebec at the time, when they entered Confederation, each one of them had denominational systems. And so those denominational systems were protected when they entered Confederation, right? That's Section 93. But New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they didn't have them, see? They didn't have them. And so that's why in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they don't have separate schools. They don't have the Catholic schools. See? This is a little bit more in depth, if you want. You can see how the progression works and how the different, early on in Canada's history, when the different provinces entered into Confederation, how things panned out. So in 1867, you can see all that green section there. That's all under British possession. You've got Northwestern Territory there. You've got British Columbia. You've got Rupert's Land and Newfoundland. All these as areas under British possession. You've just got the 4 provinces as Canada. There's the old ensign, the red ensign, Canadian flag. And then in 1870, you can see things starting to change, right? Number one, what happens is Britain says, well, we're going to give you, I guess what happens is Rupert's Land is given over by the, what do you call them, the Hudson Bay Company, right? They give it over, and it becomes part of the Northwest Territories, as does the Northwestern Territory. All these things Britain hands over to Canada, right? So Canada's those 4 little provinces. All this territory suddenly in 1870 is just given to us, and it's renamed the Northwest Territories. Now you know your map what the Northwest Territories look like now, and when I was a kid it was even bigger than that because there was no Nunavut. But since 1999 we've had Nunavut. So Northwestern Territories started. It was renamed that in 1870 from the amalgamation of Rupert's Land and Northwest Territory, or the Northwestern Territory. And then you can see in 1870 that little orange spot there, that's actually what Manitoba looked like. And Manitoba was the next province to join Confederation. And when they joined Confederation, they too, as we'll see, had a system of denominational education. So that's why when they entered Confederation in 1870, they began with denominational education system. And then in 1871, British Columbia, the Britain said, okay, now you guys can have this. And, there was certain wheeling and dealing about that and the railway and the rest of it to connect British Columbia with the rest of Canada. And, there was concern about making sure that Canada went right across because, the states down south of us, they were all hungry and they wanted to come up here and take our stuff. So British Columbia enters, but when they entered, they didn't have a denominational system of education. So Section 93 doesn't really say anything to them, okay? And you'll also notice too, in 1873, PEI, that little dot there, just above New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, PEI enters Confederation. I always found that weird that we had our Confederation talks in Prince Edward Island, but they didn't join until 1873. But that's just me. Anyway, PEI joins, but like BC, they never had a denominational system either. So Section 93 doesn't really protect anything for them. So really, thus far, all you've got, that denominational system, you've got it working in Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba, right? Okay, so it's kind of a patchwork of denominational education rights across Canada. The Constitution Act 1867 contains a guarantee for publicly funded, religious-based separate schools, provided the separate schools were established by law prior to the province joining Confederation. Court cases have established that this provision did not apply to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, but originally it was there, right? British Columbia and Prince Edward Island, since those provinces didn't provide legal guarantee for separate schools prior to Confederation. The provision did originally apply to Ontario, Quebec, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Newfoundland and Labrador, since these provinces had pre-existing separate schools when they joined. All right. However, this constitutional provision was repealed in Quebec right? It was taken away, which is interesting, by a constitutional amendment in 1997, and by Newfoundland and Labrador in 1998. And the constitutional provision continues to apply to Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. There's a similar federal statutory provision which applies to the Northwest Territories as well. Okay, so this is a kind of a famous bit of history. I'm mentioning it to you. I don't think it's going to change your life as a teacher or anything, but it's an important bit of Canadian history. Really important because it's like, you know, where Louis Riel crops up. It's the whole Manitoba schools question. It's also an excellent example of political leadership too. So again, Manitoba joins Confederation in 1870. There's pressures within this new province from English Protestants and French Catholics for denominational protections for their respective schools, right? At the time they had Protestants English schools and they had French Catholic schools. See? They wanted protections just like they did in Ontario and Quebec back in 1867. Now Parliament creates this Manitoba Act. Okay, so Parliament of Canada, Manitoba Act, what that is it goes to the Northwest Territories and it just takes a little chunk out of the Northwest Territories and calls it Manitoba. And it includes Section 22 in the Manitoba Act that essentially restates what is stated in Section 93 of the BNA Act, namely that the provinces maintain the denominational educational protections they had at the time they entered into Confederation. And the same goes for Manitoba, okay? So this is what they thought when they were entering in. They said, okay, well, we've got those protections. It's written right in here into Section 22 of the BNA, or rather of the Manitoba Act, and it's the same basic wording as it you find in Section 93. So there's the Manitoba Act, right? In and for the province, the said legislator may exclusively make laws in relation to education, subject according to the following provisions. Nothing in any such law shall prejudicially affect any right or privilege with respect to denominational schools. You can read through it. You can see it's the same though, right? It's the same wording as you find in Section 93. Okay? Now the saga continues. So at the time, things started to change, right? You got this new province, new opportunities, I guess, right? All kinds of English Protestant settlers began moving to the new province, right? So the demographics, the population starts changing, whereas less settlers were now coming from Quebec. And lots of the Métis, now those of you who don't know who Métis are, they're people who are French, but they're also, they have French people and Native people have intermingled, and they've married and they've had children, and so they're of mixed race, all right. So and mixed cultures, and they the Métis anyway. There's French-speaking people who are Aboriginal people as well. Anyway, they started to move away as well. So imagine you get like a big increase of English Protestants and a lot less French speakers and a lot less Catholics. So there grew to be quickly less public interest in preserving the Catholic denominational system, right? You get the majority starting to say, well, what the hell are we spending all this public coin on protecting these Frenchies, kind of thing, right? You can imagine the derogatory nature of the debate at the time, and you know, as it's quite common for majorities to beat up on minorities, right? Also, there was lots of intolerance for French speakers and French language culture protections in the increasingly anglicized province. So, whereas Manitoba started out with a constitutionally protected denominational education system, by 1890, the provincial government at the time passed the Public Schools Act, which got rid of this denominational system and just made all the publicly funded schools in the province non-denominational. This obviously caused a lot of bad feelings among the Catholic minority. Isn't that unconstitutional? Like, to me, it strikes me as bizarre. How could you make a Public Schools Act that craps all over the Constitution? Like, it throws me for a loop, personally, looking back at it and saying, you know, how could they do that to the French Catholics? How could they pick on them that way? How could they deny them this after this was the whole This was the compromise that they were looking for. That's what all the hullabaloo was about when the Manitoba Act came in. So it's just bizarre, right? Another thing that stirred up bad feelings was that the provincial government also took away the French language protections in Section 23 of the Act. So that English now became the only mandated language in official government affairs. So you go to court, or you go and you want to look at the laws or everything's written only in English. All the you go to court, you got to litigate or something like that. The judge wants to get a hold of you and put you on trial for something. It's all, what if you're French? No longer is it the case that you're entitled to French language in there. So you could just see, the intolerance here. Anyway, this is Thomas Greenway here, and he's the fellow who brought all this stuff in. Well, John A. Macdonald, he was our first Prime Minister, and he, needless to say, he wouldn't have thought too much of this, right? Because he was one of the original guys who helped craft the BNA Act, and Section 93 is Section 93, and he can see, a blind man can see that doesn't jibe with Section 93, so he encourages the Catholics in Manitoba to challenge the new law in court as a violation of their educational rights set down in Section 22 of the Manitoba Act, which again just mirrors Section 93 of the BNA. So Manitoba Queen's Bench upheld the law initially, right? They said, it's okay, they want to do this, this is what we can do. But this decision was appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, or the SCC, which overturned the decision and ruled that by eradicating denominational school system, the new Public School Act violated the Manitoba Act. Okay, so the Supreme Court had a serious problem with this. But then the city of Winnipeg took matters beyond the Supreme Court. See, back then you could do that because Canada was the Dominion of Canada, but we weren't completely and wholly 100% sovereign. Like because we were still part of the British Empire, the whole British Empire, every country in the British Empire, the highest court for all the countries was this one called the JCPC, or the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And so you could send any court case beyond your highest court, your own Supreme Court of your own country, to these guys, and then they would rule on it, and they'd have the final say. See? So that's what happened. The city of Winnipeg sends it to the JCPC, which, they were the highest court, even higher than our Supreme Court, and they ruled that there was no violation, which is like, wow, that's bizarre. It seems weird to us, or at least to me, but they looked at how they did some homework. See, they looked at how denominational schools were funded at the time Manitoba entered Confederation, and they found that the costs weren't covered by public taxation, right? But rather by the religious groups that ran them. In other words, yeah, they had denominational schools, but the denominational schools that existed, they weren't from public taxation. They weren't supported by public monies. So it was all done by the different religious groups. Hence, there's no pre-established right to public funding. In other words, such schools would have the right to fund themselves and exist in that regard, but not by means of public monies or support. See, so it's kind of a slippery argument, but you can see why the JCPC ruled the way they did. Well, the new Public Schools Act didn't sit well with the French Catholic population in Manitoba, but neither did it please French Catholics in Quebec. This education controversy provoked a national firestorm, as well as an upsurge in French-Canadian nationalism at the time. French Catholics naturally looked to the federal government to step in, to override the new education structures put in place in Manitoba. They sought federal assistance to secure their constitutionally entrenched religious education freedoms and rights protections, right? But remember, education is a matter of provincial jurisdiction, right? So if you're the feds, do you step into provincial matters and meddle in order to protect a minority? Or do you stay out of it? Well, the feds seemed damned if they did and damned if they didn't act in this case. In the end, they felt the need to intervene. Besides, their intervention wasn't wholly meddlesome, Section 93.3 of the BNA Act lets them step in. So I've just underlined it there. You can see I've already talked briefly about how they're allowed constitutionally to step in when it looks like dissentient school protections aren't being respected by the provinces. Besides that, the matter of the Manitoba school question was first sent back to the courts just to see what would be legit for the feds to try, and just how far they could exert their influence in denominational education, an area of provincial jurisdiction. So the question went right back up the food chain again, all the way to the JCPC, who ruled that Parliament could, if it chose, enact remedial legislation that would override the Manitoba law that wiped out the denominational school system and replaced it with a wholly public system. That sounds good, but if you're Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, see Macdonald, he died in 1891 and the Liberals swept into power. If you're Laurier, what do? If you come to the rescue with remedial laws, then you're stepping egregiously on provincial toes, aren't you? But then, if you do nothing, why, you're alienating not only your French Catholic voter base in Manitoba, but also the huge French Catholic population in Quebec. So, in a great Canadian moment of political compromise, Laurier struck a fine balance between the two sides. Under this compromise, Catholic teachers could be employed in schools with 40 or more Catholic children, and if requested by enough families, religious instruction could be permitted for half an hour a day. Where there were enough students, French could be used in addition to English. See, so that's the Canadian way, compromise. An education policy question for you. Well, what happens to the ability of governments to formulate good education policy when messy legislative compromises are rendered unworkable by the rise of rights language post-1982, when the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms comes in, right? Remember, rights are something that we can't compromise or horse trade. See, so this is the thing, like, without the ability to compromise there, what could possibly have been done? You know, both sides needed something. When both sides, need something, when you can't have an absolute winner and an absolute loser, but when there's kind of messy compromises, well, you get this, but you don't get that, and I get this, but I don't get this other thing, and it's better. But with rights language, and this has been talked about by many people who are legal scholars and who are constitutional lawyers and political scientists. Time and time again, people have written on this, that a strange thing happens to politics when it becomes infused with rights language. This was one of the things that we'll see when we start talking about court cases in relation to education with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, how rights language affects the ability of, in particular, provinces to make good education policy. And down and below here I said, for an extended example of how this difficulty affects one area of education policy in Canada, you can see an article I wrote called Judicial Activism, State Neutrality, and its Effect on Religious Inquiry and Public Education Throughout Canada. It's going to be in 2 parts, and it'll be appearing shortly in the Education Law Journal. All right, well, that's a big case study. There are other case studies that are really important too. These are much more recent, in the 1990s. Quebec and Newfoundland, right, where Section 93 protections for denominational education have been revised. I think it's important that we look at these constitutional changes to educational structures in Canada, just to see. It's good to know. Don't forget, the Constitution is the highest law in the land. It is kind of the blueprint for everything that goes on in Canada, right? So you should know something about it. So up until 1997, the Quebec education system was organized to provide for denominational schools. It made allowances for both Protestant and Catholic school boards. This system was really important at the beginnings of Canada because it protected English cultural language minorities in the province, as well as preserved the historically Catholic roots of Quebec's majority French-speaking heritage. Indeed, until the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, Quebec was the most religious and conservative place in Canada. It was a bastion for the Catholic Church too, right? However, since that time, things have changed in Quebec radically, such that now Quebec is the most socially progressive and secularized of all the provinces. The Catholic Church is certainly no longer a major social cultural force it once was. Nonetheless, Quebec remains the homeland in North America of French-speaking people. It is altogether natural that Quebecers have felt threatened by historical attempts to assimilate them into a larger Anglophone populace. And just as Canadians often worry about how we may be losing our own identity to Americanizing influences that constantly bombard us from the south, so too do French-speaking Quebecers often worry about preserving their own distinct historical and cultural identity as Quebecois in the face of wider national and global forces. There's a famous one there, Lord Durham. I don't know if you remember learning about Lord Durham. We used to teach about him in social studies in Alberta. They've gotten rid of the Canadian history component in grade 10 now, though, so maybe you're never going to learn about it again. But he was an early advocate for responsible government, but he was also kind of infamous for recommending a policy of assimilation towards the French Canadians. Like, he thought that they could just basically be swallowed up by a growing English population, which essentially, is how they got clubbed so hard in Manitoba too, right? So Lord Durham, he's a good example of why Quebecers were a little bit suspicious of English-speaking Canada. I think these are important items to consider for when we're thinking about cultural identity, which is a big part of social studies. And Americanizing influences in Canada, I mean, it's not just Canada as such that's worried about losing its identity, or Quebec as such worried about losing its identity amongst the Anglophones. Like, look at so many cultural identity is not just national in Canada, folks, it's provincial. Like, you probably come from different provinces too. I mean, I lived in Newfoundland for a while. Newfoundland is such a beautiful, wonderful, it's one of my favorite places on earth. And it if we say Quebec is a distinct society, certainly to God, Newfoundland must be a distinct society, because it is so different there. There is such a wonderful, distinct identity in that place. And I recognize it. I've lived right across Canada. I recognize regional distinctions across Canada. So I think very often we do worry about losing our identities, and we treasure these things. So there you go. Okay, so over time, Quebec, like the rest of Canada, has become very diverse and multicultural. Mind you, in the 2008 Bouchard-Taylor report, the word used for this diversity at the provincial level in Quebec is intercultural, not multicultural. Multicultural is a term that we use more at the federal level or in other provinces to describe diversity, but in Quebec they use the word intercultural for the diversity in the province. Montreal is one of Canada's most ethnically diverse cities, after all. And so the old two nations theory, right, the two nations being France and England, that once worked to create our Canadian identity and that underpins the grand mythology of Canada's beginnings, perhaps nowadays needs an update. There's two young Quebecers there wearing hijabs made out of the Quebec flag. The Quebec government still remains committed to preserving and celebrating Quebecois heritage and identity. However, this project is, in their view, most efficiently secured through powers in education and immigration, like through fostering the French language by teaching it in schools and by attracting French-speaking immigrants in Quebec. Hence, although Quebec has since the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, grown more secularized on the one hand, and also more religiously diverse, like those two young girls there, on the other hand, the importance of the French language remains the central concern in La Belle Province. So in 1977, the separatist government of Quebec, under Premier René Lévesque, passed Bill 101, which became the charter of the French language. And it made big news at the time throughout the rest of Canada as the sign law. So in other words, all signs in the windows or on the walls of businesses in Quebec had to be in French. Like any sign in public had to be in French, right? And any English on the sign had to be in much smaller font. But the Bill 101 also mandated that everyone in Quebec schools had to be taught in French only, unless your mom or your dad or your siblings had previously been taught in English within Quebec. And this was changed in 1984 after a court battle over the minority language education rights section in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which came into effect in 1982, such that mandatory French language teaching only applied if you hadn't previously lived anywhere else in Canada and received an Anglophone education there. So as you can see, the protection of language and language rights have always been an important part of education in Quebec and the rest of Canada. To summarize, even though constitutional protections in the BNA Act concern denominational schooling, language continues to be the main concern in Quebec education. After Bill 101 and the Supreme Court's Charter of Rights decision on English language education in Quebec, a linguistically based system was formally established in 1988 by the Quebec Education Act. Since the 1995 Quebec referendum, in which the yes side to separate from the rest of Canada only lost by the narrowest of margins, like 49.4 to 50.6%, other means than secession have been sought to preserve Quebec's distinctiveness within the Federation. Very important among these has been the formal constitutional replacement of the denominational system of schooling with a linguistically based secular school system after the passage of the constitutional amendment in 1997. So that's the amendment there. It's Section 93A. It just says that Section 93 doesn't apply to Quebec anymore. Which is funny because it was the original section that was put there specifically to bring Quebec into Confederation. But times have changed, right? So, amending the Constitution regarding Section 93 on education, what's up with that? Remember, since patriation in 1982, patriation is just a fancy word, means bringing the Constitution home, allowing us to, in Canada, to be able to change our own Constitution without having to ask Britain to do it, right? So since patriation in 1982, Canada has been able to amend its own Constitution without any longer seeking assent from Britain. However, as Peter Russell noted long ago in his excellent book, Constitutional Odyssey, the ins and outs of changing anything about the Canadian Constitution that affects everyone across Canada have become so difficult now that it's actually harder for big nationwide changes to be made now than it was prior to patriation. This is because since 1982, the amending formula in sections 38 through 49 of the Constitution Act has taken the form of the 750 rule. That is, in order for any nationwide constitutional amendment to pass, it must garner support from 7 out of 10 provinces that contain, in total, 50% or more of the total population of Canada. Needless to say, this can be pretty tough. However, in the case of the amendment we're talking about here, things aren't so tricky, see? This change to Section 93 only affects Quebec. See, Section 93A, look at it, it's only about Quebec, right? And so if Quebecers decide to do so, they can present amendments to the Constitution Act that affect only their own provincial matters much more easily. Hence 93A, as shown on the previous slide. So just to recap, the new educational system devised for Quebec by Quebecers is now language-based rather than denominationally based. This doesn't mean, however, that religion has ceased to be an important subject of study in the province. Don't forget how diverse Quebec has become. There are people from all around the world there with all different religious and philosophic understandings. So, for the sake of fostering civic and democratic harmony, if nothing else, certainly it's very important that Quebecers come to learn about each other's diverse ways of life and their spiritual persuasions to build greater tolerance and understanding. So, since 2008, a new ethics and religious culture curriculum has been rolled out and implemented in all schools throughout the province. And it's not an elective, folks. It's a mandatory strand of the curriculum like science or language arts that spans both elementary and secondary education in Quebec. That's interesting. This makes Quebec system unique in Canada, I think. Like, unlike in most other provinces, you can't escape learning about religion in Quebec. And everyone gets the exact same government-mandated instruction about world religions, ethics, and culture. Moreover, this is weird, any discussion of religion in schools has to be wholly objective, too. That is, you can't talk about it from a Christian point of view, or a Jewish, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, or a Buddhist point of view. Like, you could if you're a student, right? You could be those things and talk about that in your class. But as a teacher or someone who delivers the program, you cannot, right? Or as a school, you cannot. Even if your school is a private school that's built on religious affiliations. And yet, that's true. Like, so, here you are. This is Loyola High School here on the right-hand side. And Loyola's like been around since, it's older than Canada is. And it's a Catholic, it's a Jesuit school. And Jesuits invented world religions class. Like they invented comparative religions. And they've had religious studies courses there forever. But in Quebec, Loyola's run into this trouble because they're not allowed to teach world religions anymore from a Catholic point of view. They're a Catholic high school. They're a private Catholic high school. In other words, you pay. It's not a public school. It's like your parents say, "I want you to go to a Catholic high school," and I'm paying out of my own pocket. They won't let the Quebec government wouldn't let people at Loyola teach world religions from a Catholic perspective. They had to do it using the mandated ERC curriculum, which is just ridiculous, I think. But anyway, we'll talk about that court case in another one of the lectures, and you can see how things have panned out for them. So neither you nor your school can opt out of the ERC programming. You can't get your diploma. Your school can't be a school unless it uses the ERC programming. As we'll see, other provinces have decided to deal with this educational essential of teaching about religious matters in other ways. Perhaps as a class, we might discuss which among these alternatives is best educationally. Maybe we could imaginatively come up with a better system among ourselves even. How would you teach about religious matters in public school? And how will you do so in a manner that does not fall afoul of constitutional and legislative directives? These are tough questions, right? Okay, enough about Quebec. Well, Newfoundland and Labrador provide us with another excellent case study about how Section 93 education rights and denominational protections have been revised recently. At the time that the Dominion of Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, Newfoundland schools were all organized on a confessional basis, with separate denominational schools for Roman Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, Anglicans, Presbyterians, United Church, and the Salvation Army. 7 groups. There was also an integrated stream which oversaw the schooling for children of many members of so-called mainstream Protestant denominations. All these schools received grants from the provincial government for their operations. They were all tax-fed, see? In the 1990s, the province held 2 referenda. One was in 1995. It's funny because I moved out to Newfoundland to live there to go to school, and that's where I met my wife. I moved out there in 1995, and my first day, when I drove in to town in St. John's, it was the day of the referendum. It was the day of the 1995 referendum. I remember it not because I was looking for a bar, but because I was like, they were talking about how all the bars were closed on a referendum, and I didn't even know that was a practice, like on voting days and referendums and stuff. So that was news to me. I don't know if they still do that, but it was kind of interesting that it was just this quirk that I came to live in Newfoundland on the exact day of the referendum. And then they had a second referendum in 1997. But both were to decide whether or not citizens wanted to change to their religious to change their religious-based system to a secularized public school system. Having received a mandate to do so through these referenda, the provincial government ended this system with the Constitution Amendment 1998 in the Newfoundland Act. The province then established a single non-denominational public school system. Pretty interesting place, Newfoundland. Here's what the original Term 17 looked like in 1949. You can see, right? So it basically says, here we go, we're looking at Section 93, the BNA Act. In province of Newfoundland, the legislature shall have exclusive authority to make laws in education. Very similar to the other stuff, right? But then it goes, anything that we enter into is not going to screw around with any right or privilege with respect to denominational schools, the amalgamated schools, denominational colleges, all that stuff. And they'll all receive their funds. So you could see, and it's all, they put the word non-discriminatory basis down there. So like they're, right since the beginning, they're very broad, and they're very attentive to all the religious diversity in Newfoundland across these 7 different denominations, and they wanted to make sure that all of them were being respected, right? And also people who weren't of any denomination, that they were being respected. Newfoundland was very careful about that. Then in 1987, the Pentecostal churches were also added in there formally into Term 17. Why is that? Well, it's funny because originally in 1949 they weren't recognized because they not until 1954 were they actually recognized or as educators in Newfoundland. So technically they weren't protected until 1987 constitutionally as educators. But anyway, that's not the big amendment. The big amendment comes in 1998, and this is it here, right? It's just this new section. Here we've got, what do we got? In lieu of Section 2 here, we'll start with, in and for the province of Newfoundland, the legislature shall have exclusive authority to make laws in relation to education, but shall provide for courses in religion that are not specific to a religious denomination. All right. So, in other words, now they're contemplating having just generic courses, right? So the people who live in Newfoundland can learn all about all the different religions, not just those 7, but also Buddhism and Hinduism and all the different religions from around the world. And also this is cool too, religious observances shall be permitted in a school where requested by parents. So what that says is we're not going to pull religious affiliations from the schools. We've had them all through our history. If there's parents in a school and they want to have religious observances in the school, and it's important to them that those things be maintained as in traditional maintained, then we'll allow that. Then we'll make, it's written right into our constitutional amendment here that we are going to respect that. Very cool. So there's great religious pluralism in Newfoundland, see? So this is their new program of studies for 2013-2014. You could find a copy of it on the internet, but it includes, really interesting, it includes a rich religious studies curriculum for kindergarten all the way through to grade 9, and then in the high school they've got ethics and philosophy courses, ethics and social justice, world religions courses. In other words, this stuff all blossomed out of that very small constitutional amendment in 1998 where they changed it, right? They also allow for specific denominational courses to be offered where parents request, right? So it doesn't have to be a world religions kind of course. It can actually be a course offered by Pentecostals for Pentecostal kids. See? Something like that. As well as generic courses in religion offered to all kids in all schools, even where local school might have a specific denominational program design. So you might have two different programs in the same school. You might have a denominational program in the school, and you also might have a non-denominational or just like a world religions type thing going on. So lots and lots of different options in Newfoundland. Allowance for opting out too, right, of religious studies courses in Newfoundland, and it's grounded in the province's special history and traditions, which include the accommodation of non-conforming children in denominational schools with no feeling of exclusion. Alright, so those are the big ones. I also mentioned Alberta and Saskatchewan, which you may find odd, right? Because they didn't enter Confederation until 1905. In fact, they entered Confederation by being carved out of the Northwest Territories. You can see on that map that the Northwest Territories is that area highlighted with red marker. And you can see how prior to 1905, that's what Canada looked like. Northwest Territories was a series of districts. But here's the thing. In 1870, Canada gets, I think I mentioned this to you earlier, Canada gets Northwestern Territories up at the top there, plus Rupert's Land, and they form the Northwest Territories. And then, once the Northwest Territories are made, they have a kind of a founding document too, and it's called the Ordinances of the Northwest Territories. So it's kind of like the Manitoba Act or some other act that brings a province or a territory into being. And in that founding document, in chapters 29 and 30, that's where you find all the stuff to do with education. And so here we have chapter 29, sections 41 and 45, and big surprise, they have within that section of chapter 29 protections for separate schools. So in other words, right since its beginnings, really, the Northwest Territories has had protections for separate schools. So when Alberta and Saskatchewan were carved out of the Northwest Territories, those original protections for separate schools, they entered into Confederation with those in place, see? So look at here, chapters 29 and 30, the ordinances, and then you can look at section 17 of the Alberta Act, right, which makes Alberta out of the Northwest Territories. And you can see how they've got that same kind of section there, right? Nothing's going to prejudicially affect any right or privilege of a separate school, like, because you've brought it with you into Confederation, so it's something that you have. If it hadn't been brought in, there wouldn't be separate schools in Alberta. See, so that's why we have those. It goes back to the fact that prior to being Alberta was part of the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Territories had constitutional protections in its founding documents for separate schools. All right, so Janet Buckingham's assessment of the spectrum of educational approaches to denominational protections in religious instruction in public schools across Canada, I think, is kind of pertinent at this point, right? She says, or she writes rather, as one examines the complex landscape of education policy across Canada, it's difficult to point to one province as having it right. The government of Quebec is likely at one end of the spectrum. See, she sees it as a kind of a spectrum. On one end you've got Quebec, maybe on the other end maybe you got Alberta or something like that. Quebec appears to view it as desirable or even necessary for the state to shape its citizens in a particular worldview. Quebec imposes language requirements and a required course in ethics and religious culture on students. While parents have challenged their requirements because they undermine the rights of parents to determine their child's religious education, The courts have upheld the power of the state to impose educational requirements on both public and private schools. The Quebec government consulted broadly on the changes to the educational system as it was deconfessionalized, yet religious parents in Quebec have argued that they are being marginalized. Therefore, even while the government attempted to find a way forward, not everyone was satisfied with the result. She compares or contrasts that with Alberta, see? She says the province of Alberta appears to be the most accommodating and inclusive with charter schools and inclusion of religious schools in the public education system, which John Heimstra and Robert Brink call a pragmatic, pluriform public school system, unquote. These authors identify unique features of Alberta culture that may have led to such an open system, namely the commitment to a market model, a high value on choice, and reluctance to use state power to impose a single worldview on its citizens. This open model is likely to have a broad appeal in other provinces. So Buckingham thinks that Alberta is going to be a kind of a leader in dealing with, these sorts of constitutional issues about religion and religious education that have been there right since the foundation of Canada, but now, even with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 2, freedom of religion too. So here's the article she's talking about by John Heimstra and Robert Brink. It's a good article. Like many other provinces, Alberta secondary schools may offer electives in world religions. One of my schools had a world religions course. One of my other high schools did not. Not every school has them. In fact, one thing that you should know, I did a little bit of research on this. I wrote the different departments of education across Canada, different ones responded saying that they didn't have, PEI, they didn't have world religions courses there. And I think New Brunswick wrote me back a letter saying, no, man, we don't have those here, right? But lots of places make them available. So that's one way of dealing with religion in schools. But then it's only typically, electives are something you only get in high school, right? So it's unlike Quebec and it's unlike Newfoundland, where it's taught right up through ever since you're a little kid. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, I think I mentioned to you, all operate Hutterite schools within the public system. So Alberta has their alternative schools that they use to do that. Saskatchewan has different system, Manitoba has different system, but they allow religion in their public schools in some fashion. And Alberta offers faith-based alternative schools within the public system. You can learn about that if you listen to my lecture I did on the Alberta School Act. So I just highlighted a section out of the Heimstra article here, where him and Brink write, Alberta has significantly altered its former non-sectarian public schools with a minority denominational districts model, and developed a new pluriform public model that no longer seems to assume that a common school system and single ideology must be imposed to unify the political community. Although Alberta practices this in an ad hoc and pragmatic manner, its pluriform public system allows the expression of a wide variety of faith-based philosophical and cultural approaches within schooling. So it's funny, right? Because here you have an example of how Alberta seems to be very open and have lots and lots of choice. But then in the earlier lecture, when I was talking to you about the School Act, I was showing you Bill 44 and how it's become this new section in the School Act and how it's kind of a threatening, menacing piece anytime you ever talk about religion in your classroom as a teacher in Alberta. You damn well better be careful, or you could get serious reprimands and punishment and actions against you, litigation and so forth. It's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde situation in Alberta. Okay, and same thing in Saskatchewan. I'm not going to go through this, but you can see this is basically verbatim the exact same thing that's written in the Alberta Act, because Alberta and Saskatchewan were made at the exact same time. These sections are carbon copies of one another. And finally, there is no constitutional imperative to fund religious schools in Canada other than the rights afforded under Section 93 to denominational schools. However, many provinces and territories across Canada make limited funding available. So here's a chart that I've taken from a big book on the subject, where you can see, you can pause and look at it more carefully if you'd like, but the different provinces and territories and how they do they fund, are they willing to fund religious education? Do they fund separate schools? Do they fund private schools that are religious schools, or private schools at all? Do they do this? If so, how much funding is allotted to them, right? Some fund quite a bit, some hardly any, some none at all. It's an interesting kettle of fish as well. There's the second slide there. You can look at this. It's taken out of a huge book by Baevsky and Waldman, State Support for Religious Education. These are the folks who, I mentioned that court case, they took it to the United Nations, and the United Nations ruled against Canada, saying we shouldn't be doing this. And Baevsky and Waldman think, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this. Either you should be funding all religions equally, or making state funds available for all religions in some capacity, or nobody. It's all or nothing for them. And I mean, in Canada, that's not the way we roll, I guess, right? All right, so that's the end of today's long lecture on the Constitution of Canada, sections 92 and 93. I hope it has been informative for you and you've learned something. Thanks for your attention.